let's get the recording started and hope Rocky's mic doesn't get too scratchy on us, because Lord knows what's going to happen this time.
Test.
It's a little scratchy.
1, 2, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, well,
Hey,
we're going to fight through it.
Brant, give me another 30 seconds.
All right, audience, welcome to Mention and Dispatches. We're season 10. We're up to episode 9. We're still in order. I'm going to jinx us and say we might make it to the end of the season with it, because we've only got like 4 more episodes to go. So far, we've talked games rules, we've talked some conventions, we've talked all kinds of fun stuff. Tonight, we're going floating. We are going floating and talking some naval wargaming, the kind in the water, not the kind out in space. And to do that, look, I'm not the guy to do that, so I brought in a couple of guys who can do that. Ian is back. Rocky, welcome back to Mention Dispatches. You've been around a bunch this season, haven't you?
I have, and thanks for putting up with me. Appreciate it. Welcome.
Well, when we can't get anybody else to answer the phone, we call you. No, I'm kidding.
That's the trick. Okay.
We love having you here, especially for things that you know something about and we don't. So also joining us, because he actually does wet navies, not just space navies. Our buddy Chris Weave is back. Chris, how you doing?
I am doing well. How are you all?
So far, so good. By the time people hear this, you and I will probably have gone bat crap crazy from dealing with Connections Online stuff, because we'll be about a week or so out from execution. And we will probably want to be executed by then. So
I was just going to say, I don't know that executions will be necessary, but if we have to, we'll do that.
Yeah.
Whatever it takes to provide people with a good conference.
Yeah, something like that. For those curious, we're doing red teaming this year. So the theme of the conference is the enemy gets a vote. We're not going to talk a ton about Connections Online, because we've done this a bunch before and folks kind of know what they're getting into. But that's this year's theme, is red teaming and sort of the Op4 side of things. And so whether it's a living, breathing person on the other side, or some AI, or in some cases, Mother Nature, we're going to talk a bunch about different kinds of aspects of red teaming in the professional wargaming space, as well as having some other demos and show and tells, and talking about some of the state of the art of hobby wargaming, and showing some of the tools hobby wargamers use to the pros to give them a chance to maybe adapt to some of those things if they want. If you're interested, go hit our website. We got Connections Online info there over at armchairdragoons.com. We're the ones that host the archives on all the Connections Online stuff. If you're interested, please come join us. It's the 17th through the 23rd. We broadcast the stuff through YouTube, but we use unlisted links so that it's only conference attendees that can see the streams as they're happening and be able to participate live. But after the conference, we're going to open those links up about a week or so later for folks to be able to see what was discussed. You just don't have the ability to really interact with it. So did I miss anything there, Chris?
I guess I'd add 2 things. First of all, what are we charging this year? It's like $5?
It's $5, but we've got some early bird tickets available for 2 or 3 that may all be gone by the time this goes live.
So the thing about it is, we're not making any money off of it. Basically, we charge a minimum amount to try to get people to put a little bit of skin in the game. We find that they have a tendency to show up if they have actually paid even a couple of dollars for it. And the other thing is, it helps underwrite the infrastructure that we pay for out of pocket. So between Brant and I, we give the StreamYard people a lot of our money each year, and we by no means make it all back with conference fees. It just basically boils down to we're not subsidizing them quite so much. The other thing I'd say is that red teaming is one of those terms that a lot of different places, a lot of different disciplines use it in different ways. So we're actually going to start off a little bit with talking about how other people use it. And because some of those activities are actually of use to people who do more traditional war game red teaming, we are going to branch out a little bit and talk a little bit about alternative analysis, challenging assumptions type of red teaming, which is technically not quite the same thing, but it's close enough, and it's oftentimes done by the same kinds of people. And when I say same kinds of people, I mean like intelligence people that are associated with commands that are wargaming out particular courses of action and stuff like that. So as a result of that, we're casting a little the net a little broad, which we always try to do. We always try to make sure that we pick a topic each year when we do this, but we also try to not limit ourselves to only covering that topic. And that's probably way more than you wanted me to say, Brant. But you're the editor; you can take as much of that out as you want.
Yeah, it's fine. Again, we're just, hey, audience, this is coming up. If you'd like to participate, we'd love to have you. And if you don't want to participate, sorry we wasted 90 seconds of your life, but it's okay. Let's talk splashy things and actual Navy stuff. And when I pitched this to the two of y'all, one of the things that I opened up with is, the topic that I think would be interesting is, let's try and piss some people off, just because that's what generates some conversation. And so, Rocky, I'm gonna throw it to you first. Naval wargaming does a lot of different things. There's from triremes and guys floating around on wooden rafts, all the way up to modern and near future aircraft carriers and submarines and whatever else. There's a lot that we know about naval wargaming. There's a long and proud tradition of professional naval wargaming, but like every other bit of wargaming out there, we get stuff wrong. So talk to us some about what naval wargaming actually gets wrong about naval warfare.
Well, they get nothing wrong. I mean, it's form. So, I mean,
this podcast brought to you by the Naval War College.
No, they're not paying me. No, though that'd be nice. I think when we always say what is naval wargaming wrong, I think a lot of people think. I wrestled with this question after you asked it, and it was going like, well, what can I point to something that's so totally wrong? And I think actually when wargaming. I'm not being facetious. I think wargaming usually gets it sort of right, but it's people's perceptions of what they're getting that sometimes doesn't always square the circle. I mean, people think that something should happen, but the games don't always deliver that. For instance, the classics, wargaming, people always want to go and they have these giant fleet battles and they fight it out until there's nothing left on the water. That's a gamer's perception, not a game action, because rarely did you go to naval battles that just went all the way through to everything sinking in the horizon, being clear seas, horizon to horizon. But that's what people want in the game. They want the big kablooies and the imaginary glug-glugs as the things go down. So the games give that to them, which is not exactly right, but from a gamer's perspective, it's what they want. So does that make it right? Chris, what's your perception on that?
Well, some of that is not the game itself. Some of that is the players making decisions about when to disengage or not disengage. And so from that standpoint, I think anybody who talks about that, about the game being wrong, I would say, no, it's the players that are wrong. But I totally agree with you. It's like, I remember the very first time I played Avalon Hill's Jutland, we had played an entire game and we never had a fleet action. And at one point, the German player is heading for home, and he goes, well, you can't catch me. And I said, yeah, I can catch you. And he goes, no, you can't. Your fleet's not fast enough. And I said, the battle cruisers are. And he said, you're going to take on the entire high seas fleet with just your battle cruisers? And I said, Wade, we've been playing for 3 hours. I want to shoot some guns. And so we played out what would happen if Beatty and the battle cruisers played out against the high seas fleet. By the way, it turned out exactly like you would think it would, right? But this wasn't about me making a good command decision for the future of the British Empire. This was about me wanting to at least, shoot the guns. And, I'll add on to that. I had not yet articulated this, but nowadays I always tell people that the first time you play a game, the victory condition is to understand the rules at the end. And so playing through a fleet action was part of understanding the rules of that game. So I think a lot of times it's that, players don't always think like naval officers.
One of the big criticisms that I've always had of movies, war movies with any sort of combat or battle in them, applies to many of the naval war games I have observed, which is, to be fair, a mere fraction of the numbers of naval war games you guys have observed and participated in. And that is, somehow every naval war game battle, regardless of era, except for the occasional Midway game, and Midway is the very particular exception because a lot of it is go find behind the other guy. So it's a lot of hide and seek before you get around to blowing shit up. Every other naval game I've watched, whether it's a Trafalgar game or whether it's ancient Greece or whether it's the Philippine Sea or whatever, every naval war game ends up looking like one of the battle scenes from Braveheart. And I don't know if that goes back to, Chris, what you were just saying, which is gamers want to blow shit up, and so they just sort of slam everything together and hope for the best, or how much of that is bad naval tactics on the parts of the players, and how much of it is me just not knowing enough about naval warfare. And that's actually what it is. Rocky, what is it?
It's a bit of both. I mean, this is what I think I was getting at, is that the players have expectations, and a lot of them just want to go in and go kablooey. And the end result of that is many times very non-historical. I was a young guy. I went to a war game convention, Genghis Khan in Colorado, and I got roped into playing some General Quarters game that I had never played before. Battle lines sitting out there, World War II. But we just charged at each other. And it was just this giant skirmish. And I remember that some of the folks were looking at us very disgusted because we were just having a blast. I mean, we were shooting stuff at point blank range and, marking off hit boxes and everything. It was awesome. But it wasn't anything close to what maybe history would have shown would have happened.
Yeah, who cares, right?
Well, I think that's what Chris was meaning when it's the players making decisions, and it's not the game that's bad or that gets it wrong. Many times it's the players. You don't always follow the victory conditions. The Great War at Sea, Second World War at Sea series from Avalanche.
Yep.
Great. I mean, when you really take a step back from it, there's this giant fight these campaigns and everything. But I've gone entire games and never had a combat. The ships just never found each other. The fleets just never met. And you get done, you're like going like, well, I won the game. I successfully delivered the convoy and everything made it through. I won. Yet it feels so disappointing because like Chris was already talking about, after 3 hours, you want to shoot something.
Yes.
In a war game. And it's just like you sit there and you go like, I won, and it's so unsatisfying.
Yeah, at that point it wasn't a war game, it was an avoidance game.
The several hours of boredom and supposed to be a couple of minutes of terror, and all you got was nothing.
Yeah, and in some games, I mean, there are some naval games where that is the mission, right? PQ-17, the whole point is to not get shot. On your way to wherever you are. And yet I've heard people describe it as it's the Donner Party at sea, right? You're sort of wandering around in the cold, hoping you get somewhere before you run out of supplies. And in the meantime, there's random people trying to shoot you. And that's the furthest thing from Braveheart on the water. Chris, what do you think?
So I'm thinking back. I played in Mark Campbell's 2005 Trafalgar anniversary game. We did not quite have one ship per player or one player per ship. We came close, and we had about as many players as we had ships that actually got a chance to engage. I played for 5 or 6 hours before I fired my guns. Now, I actually had a fantastic time at that game, but a large chunk of that was I spent that 5 or 6 hours talking to Randy Papadopoulos, who at the time was, I think, still at the Naval Historical Center. I don't know if he was the Secretary of the Navy historian yet. I don't think he had yet moved to the Pentagon. But it was just a fantastic opportunity, and we just had this wide-ranging conversation. It was fantastic. But I was at the tail end of the French line, and it took forever for me to get engaged. It was hardcore close action players, and we kind of knew that it was going to be that way. I've seen other people, I was at a con one time playing a World War II game, and at one point we had this plan. It was a good plan. And at this one point, the destroyer commander goes off on this Leroy Jenkins death ride. And it's like, dude, what are you doing? And he goes, well, I've got another game I have to go off to. And, it's incidents like that sort of soured me on the idea of doing pickup games at conventions. Because, we had a plan, and this guy had double booked himself, and we all got to pay the penalty for it. We got slaughtered because he basically... I don't know that we would have won if we had executed our plan, but our plan certainly didn't include wasting the destroyers.
Yeah,
because he just charged, and they all got blown out before I think one of them got its torpedoes off.
So it wouldn't have been easy to just tag somebody in and out.
Well, by the time we figured out what this guy was doing, he did it. He just did it. Okay. we could have tagged somebody out. He didn't tell us, I've got another game. He only told us that after we said, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Well, I got another game.
This is all stuff about sort of what the players get wrong.
Yeah.
And I got it. Like, again, players want to blow shit up and players that guy, the problem with that guy wasn't the naval war game. The problem was that guy. There are things that ground combat inherently gets wrong in war games just by nature of the war games. And I'm not going to sort of regrind all of the axes that I've ground on previous podcasts, but the recon and intel fight before the main battle is horribly mismanaged in tabletop war games. And I can speak to the land combat part of that because that's the part that I know. I imagine a similar thing is likely true in many naval war games in that the enemy's order of battle as soon as you open the box. So that's already sort of a problem in developing an unknown situation in the midst of a battle. But whether it's the maneuverability of the ships, the assumption of instantaneous global communication, whether it's the actual abilities of the ships as noted in the games, what are some of the kinds of things in the war game itself that are less about the players, although expectation management can certainly be a facet of it? What are some of the actual game component things that we see screwed up somewhere? Rocky, you've done a lot of these, whether it was Pacific Tide or Blue Water Navy, some of the ones you've written up for us, South China Sea, so some of these different ones. What are some of the things you see that kind of get a little gacked up in there?
I'll just broaden out to naval wargaming as a whole is, yeah. I think one of the hardest parts to do or hardest parts to figure out how to game is damage. I think going back to like what Chris was talking about, old Jutland, you have a ship, you have a certain number of hit boxes, you shoot and you're marking off hit boxes, and you go down until hey, I lose half my hit boxes, half my firepower is gone. Damage on ships is never linear, but yet a lot of games treat it just in that very linear fashion. Even go back to like Wooden Ship and Iron Man. I mean, you have your sails. You keep marking off boxes. Okay, I'm down to a certain point. I can only go half speed. Now I can only do quarter speed. So how they do modeling damage, I think really is hard to do. Come to the present or close to the present. Look at last year with the Russian cruiser Moskva. I mean, so supposedly hit by two not very big cruise missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, and it's sunk. And yes, there's been a lot of analysis and stuff going there, but I think most war gamers at first look at it goes like, well, how the heck did that happen? There's no way that those puny little missiles could take out that big ship. I mean, there's no way it can mark off enough hit boxes. So the games, how they model damage really in some ways creates false expectations, or people say, oh, my ship can survive all that, and it can't. I think the Moskva shows a good case of not very good material condition and not very good crew for damage control, progressive damage, which some war games have, and I think a lot of people sort of, oh, okay, my ship's on fire. Next turn, I'm going to roll a dice and let's see if I put out the fire. Oh, I put out the fire. Okay, everything's back to normal. Game on. And that's, if there's anything, I'd say that's what gets things wrong. Chris, I'm going to throw this one back over to you. What's your thought on that?
So I pretty much agree with everything you just said about damage.
Gotta stop doing that.
Yeah, but let me go to some other factors that they don't cover. So
please.
Let's take a look at the Battle of Jutland. The Battle of Jutland, neither commander could see his entire line because it's the North Atlantic, and the visibility in the North Atlantic is always crappy. So he's giving orders to ships that he can't see. They're reporting via radio, which was a brand spanking new technology at that time. And you've got people that are reporting like, I can see him, he's at such and such, but they're not like giving their own position, right? They're giving relative range and bearing from their location without actually giving their position. By the way, I've seen that happen in the U.S. Navy also. So it's not a problem that's gone away. It's one of those things that you have to be meticulous in your training to get people to do that all the time and to make sure that information always gets passed up the chain. Jellicoe had a technology that Shearer did not have, and that was a plot. He had somebody who was basically just keeping track of where everything was and marking it down on a paper chart so that he could come and look at it and make decisions based upon it. That was a new idea at that point because the fleets were big enough that you had to do that. And those radio operators, I don't know this for a fact, but my guess is those radio operators are pretty deep within the ship. And so the admiral or his flag lieutenant are probably writing out what they're going to have the radio guys say, and then they have to run it down to where the radio is. It's not like it's right there on the bridge with him. Because of there is a separate radio room where all that stuff is going out. And, messages are coming back to him the same way. How much of that stuff have you ever seen represented in a war game? I mean, theoretically, it's kind of baked in there, in terms of like what the movement rates are and stuff like that. But the cognitive space in which you, as a guy who's in the role of Jellicoe, has versus what Jellicoe had is a much, much different thing. There's a whole bunch of things. There's information you've got that Jellicoe didn't have. There's things that he's worried about that aren't included in the game, so you just don't have to worry about.
Well, so Chris, let's solve for X here a little bit in a couple of these cases. You mentioned the idea of having somebody sort of, plotting on the map. Anybody that's been near a command post knows this is just battle tracking, right? This is a normal practice today, but was a little weirder back then. Is depending on what you're modeling in the game and how, this might be accountable through some sort of initiative bonus or some sort of freedom of action based on, that we're incorporating some form of predictive analysis or giving them the credit for that predictive analysis by allowing them to act in some way superior to the opponent. That's something that seems like we could bake into the rules should we choose to do so, right?
Yeah, we could. And some games do, and other games don't, because they, for a variety of reasons. If nothing else, they're rules that add on to the complexity of the game. Right. These are not the, let's just say these rules are not in Avalon Hill Jutland, right? Jutland's a pretty simple game. So this is the sort of stuff that you include in simple games. This is the sort of stuff you generally include in more complicated games. Yep. And, a lot of times players don't like that stuff. They kind of want to have the freedom of action to sort of, stand up there like an orchestra conductor and have everybody doing the thing, right? And not have to worry about their orders being misinterpreted or stuff. There's a lot of grognards that like the fact that they're representing history and would prefer that. But there's other people, it's like, this is just so complicated. And I don't like the fact that it doesn't let me do stuff. Chris Carlson has talked about how with the new version of Harpoon, they really sort of, Chris doubled down on figuring out how all the data links and fire control stuff works, et cetera, et cetera. And the end result is the fire control stuff is now more complicated than it was before. And it's mostly in the form of restrictions, right? Stuff that players could do before they can't do anymore. And they're not happy about that. It's like, why'd you break it? It's like, I didn't break it. I fixed it. Yeah. They're not happy.
Part of it goes back to when we say, what do they get wrong? In many cases, it's probably what you just mentioned. What do they leave out? And then the follow-up question, obviously, is why? One of the main reasons you leave these things out is reducing complexity, right? Mike Markowitz's famous proliferation of complexity, followed by ruthless simplification, followed by a proliferation of complexity, followed by ruthless simplification. And so in some cases, you're just simplifying things so people have less mental lift to play the game and just have fun, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't make for the most realistic thing, but you may not be after realism. You may want something closer to Battleship, and that's okay.
So I think my friend Brian McHugh had a couple of sort of maxims that I don't remember who he credits for them. He basically, if you call them McHugh's laws, he always says, no, I didn't come up with either one of these. But he's the one who I remember articulating them. and they are, that the sort of decisions that the player makes should be at least similar to the sorts of decisions that the real world person in that same level of command would be making, right? So it's like, don't have them do a puzzle to represent something else. They should be making the same kinds of decisions. And the second thing is, the game should be as realistic as it can be for its chosen level of complexity. So note that sort of implicitly rejects the complexity realism trade-off, which I don't believe in the complexity realism trade-off either. I think the right way to think about it is for the level of complexity that I've chosen, have I made the game as realistic as I can make it for that given level of complexity?
Yeah.
And if you want a simple game, if you don't want a complex game, you're going to get less realism, but that's okay, because as long as it fits that criteria.
Yeah.
The problem I have are not the games. Somebody once said in this was on, I think it was either ConSML or Nav Wargames, one of those two mailing lists. Somebody once said in relation, it must have been ConSML, in relation to a particular game company whose, I won't say their name, but their initials are Avalanche Games. That it's like, well, you guys are professionals about this stuff. Some of us just want a simple game, and it's like this isn't about simplicity. This is about being wrong. When you actually use historical tactics and it causes you to lose, then that's a sign that they have failed the test.
Probably.
So, yeah.
Well, I mean, were the historical tactics the ones that won? Because I would argue that if you use the historical tactics that the British used at Cowpens, you should lose.
No, these are cases where if you use the combat proven tactics, you will lose.
And that wouldn't be a good thing.
And I can think of that. That was true. They had a Roman Legion game, or it was you're playing a Roman battle, a land game, and if you actually tried to use period tactics, you didn't do well. And I remember at their Great War at Sea game had an advanced tactical game that did not take facing into account. And so the right answer was to put your ships in a blob. If you tried to fight with a battle line, you lost. And they charged extra for that. And so, I mean, there's some things about Avalanche. I know people that really liked the Avalanche system in part because they had it had a campaign system associated with it. But I saw a lot of things there where I said, one of the things that can really get under my skin is when somebody tries to claim a qualitative difference for something that's really just a quantitative thing. Like, for instance, they made a big deal out of, you can have your entire fleet on one sheet of paper. Well, yeah, but okay, this particular ship has 10 fuel points, and at a regular burn rate, you use half a fuel point, and at a full burn rate, you use 2 fuel points or something like that. Or it was a fourth at a regular burn rate. And it's I can't track that on the sheet. I have to have another sheet of paper to track all the fractions. So they claim that, hey, we can fit it all on one sheet of paper. Well, hell, I can fit anything on one sheet of paper if I don't actually fit it on one sheet of paper. Why not just say everybody's got a single fuel point and track the fractions of the fuel point someplace else?
Sounds like you need some cubes on that sheet of paper just to drive wargamers crazy.
Or something, but it was just, I just didn't think it was a particularly well executed design. And they made a big deal out of when it turns out those advanced tactical rules were garbage, they then came back and said, well, those were just playtest rules. It's that's not what the sticker that you put on the outside of the box said. The sticker on the outside of the box said advanced tactical rules included. Said nothing about them being a playtest set.
Yeah. So, Rocky, anything else you want to chime in on sort of where things get screwed up in naval wargaming here?
Well, I think Chris alluded to some of it, and some of that is just simply, and you talked about it too, search. I mean, if you really want to do search the right way in a naval war game, you probably will need to play double blind, which is a whole nother level of complexity. But I mean, you need to have your plot, and you're sending out your searches, and sometimes they go the right place and sometimes they don't, and they report back and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they report back accurately and sometimes they don't. And you're sitting there with this sheet in front of you that may, this map, this chart, if you're into nautical terms, you have your chart in front of you, and you're taking this plot, and and you're like, well, that's where the bad guys should be, but my only report says it's only destroyers, but it's like 10 of them, and he's not supposed to have 10 destroyers, so maybe that's the main body. What do I do? I mean, if you want to get it right, the search and the counter search, you gotta step up the complexity. That's why, in some ways, when you mentioned one of the recent games, Task Force, the new one from VUCA Sims, finds a game mechanism to try to get past that by doing a chit draw. You have dummy fleets and regular fleets out there, and you use a chit draw to try to give you the results of the searches. Is it realistic? There's no search planes. You're still looking at the players are looking at the shared board. There's nothing realistic about that. But as a game, it sort of comes a little bit closer, and it's not as complex as a double blind. So that you got that going for you. But the whole scouting, anti-scouting, I love the rule in 1805, Seas of Glory, which is the Napoleonic Wars, where you're counting masts in the enemy port. You're counting masts. How many masts are there? You go, okay, well, that's got to be a big fleet. That's got to be a small fleet. Little period flavor pieces like that can make a difference. But what it all comes down to ultimately is how do you model? How do you create a game mechanism for searching and counter searching? Some games do it better than others. The old Avalanche was very straightforward. You everything was pre-plotted, and you just sort of move around until you stumble into each other or get close enough that maybe your searches can find something. It's maybe a bit more realistic in some ways, but again, ultimately in many ways unsatisfying, because once again, the players, you're playing a war game, you want to get to the boom.
Yeah. When you're not blowing shit up, you somehow feel cheated a little bit in the war game. So.
And I think that's actually one of the big problems that a lot of times you're talking about. What do war games get right? What do war games, the question you didn't ask is what do war games get wrong? I mean, what war games get right is they get you to the boom sometimes, but what they're getting wrong there is how you got to the boom. So, I mean, that's why so many times, so many of these naval war games start with, okay, you both start at the edge of visual sighting range, and then you plot, or maybe you just you pre-program a couple of moves until somebody has seen the other, and then they're free to move. So it's artificial, but it also bypasses a lot of that problem. It's like, it's a big ocean, little ships. Maybe they'll never meet, like Avalanche many times does, Great War at Sea, Second World War at Sea. But a lot of them get past that by just saying, we're just going to set you up right at the edge of visual range, and you both know you're out there, so you're going to steam towards each other, and you'll get to the gun range really quick.
Yeah, so you sort of led to where I was going to go next, which is, we led off some with what does naval wargaming kind of get wrong relative to naval warfare. There's obviously some things they're going to get right, and some things that they're going to nail perfectly, and some things that they're going to get close enough to where, you're playing a game, but you're still in the appropriate decision space for replicating the conflict that we're purporting to put on the table in front of us. And so with that in mind, Chris, what's an example of something that you've seen naval war games get more right than wrong, or dead perfect, if you can think of one that's nailed something exactly right?
I think the SimCan games, which I'm drawing a blank on, there was a World War I game and a World War II game.
Battleship, and I think it was Dreadnought.
Yeah, something like that were reissued. If I were actually at home, I could go into my storeroom and they're right on the shelf.
Yeah, the Omega Games one. Newberg's games.
Yeah, that sounds right. That they were reissued by Omega Games. They seem to have a pretty good understanding of the interplay of armor and gunfire. I have a little bit of a question. I need to pull the thread on it a little bit. They maybe give you information in such a way that you're not quite thinking like the World War I guys were. By the time you got to World War II, they were thinking in terms of immunity zones, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure that the World War I guys were thinking in those terms. They were thinking more in terms of what they needed to do to hit.
Yeah, the games you're looking for are Battleship and Line of Battle.
Yes.
Tactical capital ship combat games.
Yes, and they're both very good. Haven't played them in way too long, but they're both very good. And so I think think they did a pretty good job of getting that right. One of the things that I think is that I think this applies to all war games, but it certainly applies to naval games, which is not every scenario is going to work at every scale. There are some times where the right answer is to say, yeah, that's just not fun. That scenario is not fun at that scale. And the thing that the Avalanche game, I did a lot of shitting on Avalanche. So let me say something good about them. The thing that they really kind of understood is that they had to, if they were going to make this work meaningfully, they had to have a campaign over game of some sort, right? So you do very much have the operational level game, and then you have the tactical level game with their stuff. So you can do that search, the first step is to find them, and then you can actually fight the battle. I think they were much better at the finding them game than they were at the tactical game, at the then doing the battle in the hex. So much so that we generally very quickly got to the point where we would use it to generate the battle, and then we'd play the battle out in something else. So if the forces actually encountered each other, we'd then play it out in some other miniatures game, or Ship Base 3, because this was long enough ago that Ship Base 3 was an answer.
Oh my gosh, that is such a great game.
Yeah. For those who haven't seen it, Ship Base 3 was a computer-assisted war game rules done by a guy named Dave Ferris. And so you needed a computer. It ran under DOS. It was fantastic. Now, a conversation...
We're just going to make the assumption that everybody listening is old enough to remember what DOS is, because our two fans that are under 30, we're just not going to take the time to explain it to them.
Yeah. So this was an operating system that involved...
I just said we weren't going to explain it to them, Chris. Come on. You're merling on me here.
I am merling on you. But I was going to say it's an operating system that involved like stone tools and abacuses and, slide rules and shit. But Dave once told a story on Consimel about, the thing is, if you go and you talk to any of these guys who design naval war games, they all, fans get very passionate about which game is the right game, but these guys all talk to each other. They all know each other. Rich Sartori and Chris Carlson talk all the time, and they trade data back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. Their games are very different. Their audiences are very different. The audiences sometimes, will get a little huffy with each other, but Rich and Chris don't, because they just, I designed the game I want to play. You designed the game you want to play. That we design different games, and that's perfectly fine. Dave Ferris tells a story that really sort of emphasizes you can't please everybody. And if somebody isn't pleased with your game design, you should just say, okay, that's great. Somebody
else.
Yeah, somebody said, Dave, your game is wrong. Ships die too fast. Destroyers die too fast. And he said, well, how fast are they dying? It's like, oh, they died in like 15 minutes. Well, in this other game I used to play, it'd take them like 2 or 3 hours to die. It's like, okay, well, how many turns are you playing in Ship Base in that 15 minutes? And go, about 3 turns. Okay, in the other game, how many turns would it take how many turns did you play? Well, it was about 3 turns. Okay, so they're dying just as fast. The turn scales of the games are approximately the same. They're dying at the same speed. It's just the one game plays faster.
Yeah, it's a more efficient death.
It's a more efficient death. You could get in way more turns because the computer is rolling all the dice for you and doing all the other stuff. You just basically tell it what move you did, measure the distance, put that into the computer, and it calculates everything else. So you can burn through turns.
Yeah, option 2 sounds interminably boring to me. Maybe it's just me.
No, it's not just you. I really liked Ship Base because I would like to be able to play something through to conclusion. Although sometimes, it's like, how many World War II Eastern Front games do you know? Games that start at the beginning of the war that only get to about late 43 before the German player says, okay, I'm done. You win. Right? Yeah. Happens fairly frequently because you sort of get to the point where it's just not fun anymore. And, I always felt bad for the Russian players because, they had to put up with this isn't fun for Barbarossa. And then later when it turns fun, the German player wants to quit. Used to see that happen all the time.
It still does.
That's usually around turn 2 in a Little Bighorn game.
Yeah. Now, the flip side of that is Mark Herman's Pacific War, where if it's October 1945 and the Japanese haven't been forced to concede yet, the American victory condition is only met in October of 1945, that is a Japanese victory.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one way that you can scale some things that might otherwise seem fairly inevitable through the sheer weight of numbers over a long haul game. Again, do the math, right? The Texans cannot win at the Alamo. So you've got to scale your victory conditions to do the Texans hold out longer than they did at the original Alamo. And that's game design, right? That's where the game design is what takes over from what might otherwise seem an unbalanced situation. So
yeah, and if you can find a hook like that works, that's great. And if you can't, then the right answer is to say this is not a very gameable situation.
All right, so Rocky, what do you say to the criticism that too many modern naval war games are in fact air games?
Welcome to the real world. Sometimes people want to say that. I think the gamers are still working with how do you really model. The war game designers are working with how do you really put in the game missile warfare and warfare at naval warfare at real distance. Not just, the Battle of Midway was fought 150 miles.
Yeah.
Now we're talking thousands of kilometers.
Well over the horizon.
How do you do that? Yeah, well. Not just go up a little bit and go over the horizon. Yeah, thousands of kilometers across the horizon. I still think game designers are still wrestling with how do you do that? Is it a matter of scale? Is it a matter of speed? How do you portray that action across that distance? I think they're still exploring with it. One solution has been to make it sort of like an air game, and I think a lot of people are like, well, maybe you need to keep working and find another way to do that. To me, the breaking the chains in South China Sea comes a little bit closer, but again, even they are having some problems. They when you throw in like anti-ship ballistic missiles traveling across the whole map, things just don't seem to work right, or maybe they're working right, and again, it's a matter of gamer expectations. It's like, oh, wait a minute, that is not supposed to be that easy. You can't sink my carrier on turn 1. What do I do the rest of the game? So I think there's a lot of design space still to be explored out there, but I think also it comes down to the players at this point really just don't know what they want, because we're still trying to figure out what the world looks like out there in modern warfare.
Yeah. So similar discussion. How do you do submarines? Given that you've got a 2-dimensional map to play with and you're not supposed to even see that they're out there?
Well, you play blind, double blind again. It's complex, but in many ways, somebody who really likes the Kriegspiel maybe would like hearing this, but you really got to play, 2 rooms, separate maps, imperfect information still.
Well, the truth is, double blind, you really need 3 rooms because the referee's got to have the God view in the middle, right?
Exactly, and double blind really is a 3-way game, yet another level of complexity.
Yeah,
submarine combat is very, very interesting in this regard because a lot of times you've got an indication there's somebody there, but you don't know exactly where. One way to do it is to do it double blind, but it gets really complicated really fast. ASW is hard. I used to be an ASW analyst. ASW is hard. It's hard to keep it all straight. It's hard when you've got a lot of resources that you can throw at it, let alone if you're trying to recreate that in a game. That having been said, one of the best submarine games I ever saw was a miniatures game and it was very much of a design for effect sort of approach, not as a design for cause one. And the thing is that the effect, the way that the designer designed it was you could have the information, but you couldn't use it. Like I can see the submarine on the map, but I can't actually use it. And it was based upon a technique that was originally borrowed from Avalon Hill's Attack Sub.
Yes.
Which is a card-driven game, doesn't actually have a map, but it's a card-driven game of submarine combat, and it's all based upon taking actions to increase your contact level if you're the surface ship hunting the submarine, or decreasing the other guy's contact level if you're the submarine. So you're maneuvering with cards, trying to improve your situational awareness or degrade the other guy's situational awareness. And I saw that translated into a submarine miniatures game where if you didn't have a high enough contact level, you only vaguely knew where it was. As your contact level went up, the submarine might move, your target might move to a location that's closer to where it, quote unquote, really is. And then, you had to get to a certain level to have a good probability of hitting. So submarines are hard to do as a design for cause thing because of the limited information. And as a design for effect thing, they can be kind of complicated too, but if the designer knows what they're doing, you can actually get something that's playable. That having been said, there just really aren't that many submarine board games. And the number of good submarine board games are quite limited also.
Well, that's one of the challenges that you run into is that in land combat, you're basically fighting in two dimensions unless you graft an air game onto it. And even then, a lot of times you can get away with abstracting out the air superiority battle and simply focusing on sort of close air support. And helicopters are low enough to the ground that you can incorporate them into the ground combat model. Once you start moving into an air game, now you need three dimensions because of the elevation, the altitude at which those guys are flying matters. And that becomes a much bigger deal. Elevation in an ASL game, great. The guy's on the second story of a building. He's a little easier to spot. He can look over the tree you're trying to hide behind or whatever. But when you start talking thousands of feet of altitude difference, you really need a better way to try to represent that on a map. And you have a hard time doing that by and large. There are different ways you can do it. None of them are particularly elegant, but a lot of people have tried. The challenge you run into with submarine warfare is you're doing the exact same thing. You're just going down instead of up. You still need three dimensions to work with, right?
That's not as big a deal as you might think, because the submarines don't go very deep. The official Navy for years, the Navy would always say deeper than 400 feet, faster than 20 knots. Now they say deeper than 800 feet, faster than 25 knots. But you look at any of Friedman's works or any place else, you'll see numbers on the order of like 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet or 2,000 feet for various submarine depths. That's nothing compared to the level of verticality that you get in the air. For submarine stuff, the real important stuff is have I done something indiscreet, like stick a mast up into the air part of the naval environment? Or am I above the layer, or, your entire submarine, am I on the surface? And if you're below the surface and you're not doing that, am I above the layer or below the layer? That's really most of what you need to track. The difference in most cases between being at 300 feet and being at 900 feet aren't really that great.
Well, but you're still below your opposition. Nobody driving a tank around is worried about another tank shooting him from below.
That's true, but my point is simply that I can do it with a couple of status markers as opposed to having to sort of track altitude, right?
Fair enough.
So surface, above the layer, below the layer, and you need to make sure that you don't go below crush depth, right? So there is the equivalent of crashing into the ground. I once saw some instructions for pilots that said, the air is big, try to stay in the middle of it. You want to avoid the edges of the air.
Yeah.
So try to stay in the middle.
Here comes the 10th season of the Armchair Dragoons podcast, mentioned in dispatches. Let's thank all of our Patreon supporters who pledged at the top level. A huge thank you to Stagger Wing, Martok, Patrick Garrity, Fred and his dog, Mike Quigley, Joseph Knorr, Treb Corey, Robert, Patrick Mullen, Kevin Bertram, Chet Bell, and Hellcat6 for their support of the Armchair Dragoons and helping us to bring you the best strategy gaming content on the web. You too can sign up as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/armchairdragoons.
Rocky, we were talking earlier on over the horizon stuff. At a certain point, the map is only so big, isn't it?
It is. So you got to figure out scales. But I think, again, much like the sub games, part of it is it's going back. Well, it all sort of comes together. Just it's using different terms. Finding your enemy. In the old days, the Mark I eyeball, and that was pretty hard to jam. Maybe at night, maybe in bad weather and such, you could interfere with it a bit, but you were basically, your search sensor was the eyeballs. And you go out a little bit further and you come in. Nowadays, yeah, we're a far distance, but it's still fundamentally the same problem. You're trying to find the enemy. And much like Chris was talking about in the sub game, what you're trying to do is find the enemy by really many times taking advantages of how they're being indiscreet. Do they have their radars on? Do they have something unique about their radars? Can you put a sensor out there that can see them that they can't see, or that they can't detect? Are you using something that's going to give yourself away? So, I mean, yeah, the technology is different. Yeah, the distances are different, but fundamentally, in many ways, I guess what it comes down to, it's all the same problem. And I think maybe now that I'm thinking about this, maybe I think sometimes games just get a little bit carried away in the modern days by saying, well, I'm doing something that's obviously very modern and up to date and complicated, so I need to have a game model that does something very modern, up to date, and complicated. When in many ways it may be something like Task Force does, that just do a chit pool, and that is enough of the representation of the chance and the probability of things happening that it becomes a game that feels right, and it gets you to boom eventually. But it doesn't overcomplicate it.
Yeah, it seems like if there is a significant technological difference, you need a way to account for that in the game. If there's not a significant technological difference, then it's, you can level those things out. You don't have to make them more complex than something that isn't featured in the game. You mentioned the difference between just, eyeballing things versus some sort of technical sensor for target acquisition. If everybody's working off of technical sensors and they're roughly equitable technically, then everybody just uses the same procedure, because we're going to work on the assumption that everybody's using the technical tools and not standing out there with their eyeballs trying to find the other guy. Is that a fair statement?
I think it works. I'm thinking back to some of the original, even, the original war games, which literally when you played, you had an eyeball. You'd sit down and try to estimate distances by eyeball. And eventually they said,
okay,
you
Fletcher Pratt.
Fletcher Pratt. Yep, let's sit down. Or eventually you're allowed to use a tape measure as though you had a radar system that was ranging for you. Or even before that, rangefinders to give you something other than your eyeball sitting there doing it. I mean, it gets to the point, I think what I was trying to drive at, very poorly, was that sometimes it's the overcomplication of the rules that get in the way. And maybe you need to be simple. I mean, going back, Chris was talking about, the immunity zone. If you go back to like a Jutland game at the time, many of those navalists at the time everything was weight of fire. I'm going to throw this many tons of shell at you, and that's going to tear you away. In many ways, that's the way the game model works in Jutland, is if I just throw enough shells at you and score enough hits, I'm going to tear you away. So maybe from the perspective of today, it looks a bit unrealistic, but from the perspective of what they were at the time, maybe it looks appropriate. So, I mean, your point of what do games get right? What do games get wrong? Many times, again, I think games get it right, and maybe they get it right in ways we don't really expect.
Yeah, are they getting it right enough, I guess, is the question there, right?
And right enough, and many times, we'll say it again, many times for war gamers, right enough means, do I get enough boom out of it? So, but that, we already beat that horse to death. That's a whole nother issue.
I'm a little hesitant to dive into this one, but what the heck? It's already clear I don't know what I'm talking about with naval wargaming, so I'll throw this one out there anyway. The role of Marines has changed over the years in naval war games, in navies themselves, not necessarily the war games. Originally, they were the folks manning the weapons. Then later, they became sort of the expeditionary force that disembarked from the the boat. These days we're deploying the U.S. Marine Corps places where no boat can get to, like Afghanistan. But that's just because they were bored and wanted to be a part of the only war we had going. As you look at the role of how the shipboard complements have changed over the years, is this something that needed to be addressed in war games? If not, why did people do it anyway? If so, did they do it well, or is it something that could have and should have been far more abstracted than it ever was, or was it too abstracted and it needed to be more granular? Chris, I'll throw it to you first. We'll swing back around to Rocky and let him think about it for a second.
So I'm kind of inclined to challenge your assumption on that. I'm thinking back over the games that I've played over the years. The only one that really had Marines as something I had to think about that was a naval game was Close Action. Wooden Ships and Iron Men also, but I only played it a couple of times before I shifted over to Close Action, and that's my Age of Sail game. And so in the Age of Sail, Marines are, in those games, it's like, oh yeah, I actually plot what the Marines are going to do. They can fight fires. They can, if they're not otherwise engaged, they can shoot at close ships. They can do all sorts of things. There isn't if you're playing the naval battle of Guadalcanal, the Marines, they're ashore, they're fighting the land battle of Guadalcanal, but they're not really participating in the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Most of the games that I play, the Marines aren't a factor. Now, when you get up to I'm thinking very tactically, when you get up to something that looks like an operational level game, yeah, there might be a counter, and they might have some sort of amphibious capability that makes them more important, or more useful for certain types of missions. But they're just another unit in that regard. And there's always been units like that.
Yeah, I gotta agree with Chris. I mean, the only time really Marines in naval games are those Age of Sail games where you want to put your Marine sharpshooters up aloft so they can plink off the other side's commander, to sweep the decks with gunfire and try to musket fire. To try to interfere with your that broadside you got coming at you. I think it's a maybe it's a bit of a romanticized view of how they're working, but it's a fun element in the game. Repel borders. Oh, my Marines they have the cutlasses, so they get an extra strength point to repel borders. It's a lot more fun. Other games, I think nowadays. I mean, I'm interested to see how Sebastian Bay's Littoral Commander is going to go, because that has the whole Marine Littoral Regiment, which, unlike the Battle of Guadalcanal when the Marines were engaged ashore, now they're supposed to be reaching out into the sea. And we'll see how that plays out, at least plays out in the game. We'll see how it plays out in the real world, too. With all the controversy over Marine Littoral Regiments, but that's not a war game. That's Pentagon speak.
But it's Pentagon speak of a war game that will be, hitting folks' tables, we hope, fairly soon.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that one too.
You guys could have just shown up at Origins and seen the copy Sebastian sent us to monkey around with 2 years ago.
I was at. Oh no, I wasn't at Origins.
No, that was the October Origins. That was the wacky schedule.
Yeah, I wasn't at that.
So,
but Sebastian is going to be. So there's this little gaming convention being done in Newport, Rhode Island in August, if I remember correctly, August or September.
It's August.
Yeah, because it's before the big game I'm doing for the day job.
No, it's August because people keep saying, "Hey, you're going to go to that?" Well, no, it's the weekend of my anniversry. I got better things to do. I like my wife more than I like you guys.
You need to get your priorities straight. So actually, mentioning my day job reminds me that I have not said at any point during this, and I should, that I am not speaking for any employer, past or present, and presumably future as well. But so these are my own views. I'm not speaking for anybody else. Should have said that up front.
Don't worry about it. You've been on this podcast enough that we know by now.
Yeah. Well, everybody. The key is does my employer know that?
Yeah. I'll include the disclaimer. People by now will have read the disclaimer on the post where the podcast is found.
Sounds good. Sounds good. But Sebastian's going to be there at that little convention. I'm going to be there, and I'm looking forward to actually seeing the game because I assume he's going to bring it. So that should be fun.
By then, you may have your own copy to bring.
I may. There's a lot between now and then. There's a lot keeping me busy.
Yes.
So.
Well, I'm glad you guys both shot down my Marine question because it, again, goes back to reemphasize, I don't know what I'm talking about with naval wargaming. I'm not supposed to know what I'm talking about with naval wargaming. I don't do naval wargaming.
Well,
I do naval gazing.
So, okay, let's go back and examine that a little bit more. As Rocky said, it's, the world is changing in that regard. I think Rocky said this. Maybe it was you, Brant. One of you said.
If it was smart, he said it.
The world is changing in that regard, and they're talking about putting the literal regiment in to do its thing. And, the Marines are making the argument that they've got a role for that, which means that if you're playing a game at the appropriate scale, if nothing else, the values on the counter are going to change. And if you're playing a game about that theater, and the Marines are making the argument that we have capabilities, we're developing capabilities, we're gonna have capabilities that allow us to play in that fight, as is the Army. The Army's saying similar things. And your game doesn't capture that. It sort of makes you wonder whether the game is an accurate enough representation of exactly what that scenario is, right? Presumably if they're changing doctrine, if they're changing TO&E, if they're changing their basic their missions, then the war games that include them should reflect those changes. And if they don't, then it's perfectly fair for the consumers to be asking, why don't the games reflect that? So far, I haven't seen any games that do really reflect that, but I'll admit I haven't really been looking. Presumably, Literal Commander will do that.
Look, there's a comparable discussion going on in the ground warfare world where folks, with the Cold War Goes Hot games coming back into fashion, everybody looks at those things and goes, oh, there's M1s there, there's M1s today. We can just use a game from 1985 or a game about 1985 to talk about warfare in 2025. You realize that was 40 years ago, right? And it's like 40 years from that 1985 game and you're at the end of World War II. Don't you think things have changed a little bit since then? But people see an M1 tank then and an M1 tank now and they go, oh, it's the same kind of thing. And ignore those TO&E changes. They ignore those technical changes that have made units more lethal and with a greater area, in which they can act and affect things.
And they ignore the doctrine changes. I mean,
yeah. And well, here's where I'm going to give the wargamers a pass on the doctrinal changes. A big part of folks playing around with the wargaming is to ignore the doctrine, right? If these guys do what I want them to do rather than what they're sort of air quote programmed to do, then I could win this battle in this completely non-doctrinal fashion.
Yeah, except
that's kind of normal.
That looks good on paper, but this is the problem that we've run into, that I've run into this. So I was at the center. I was a war game designer for the Center for Naval Analysis for 6 years. And then I went off to the Naval War College Wargaming Department for 5 years. And so this is one of those things that I used to run into all the time where people would say, hey, I've got this game, I want to use it to do this. And it's like, all right, tell me what the assumptions were that game was built on, because you can't just ignore the doctrine, because frequently the doctrine is built into the game. Things work if you use them in the way they're designed, and they don't work if you're not using them in the way that they're designed. And sometimes if you've got a lot of knowledge about the field, you can spot it, and sometimes you can't. And sometimes it makes a difference and sometimes it can't. One of the things I like about paper war games is that it's easier to figure out what they're doing and why they're doing it, and it's easier to change it. One of my colleagues in Newport talked about how we went around looking for computer games that we could use for one of the gaming projects I was involved with up there. And one of the things, this actually happened about a year before I got there, so I wasn't part of that process, but I heard the aftermath of it. One of the things that they discovered is that the manuals are never correct, because the manuals are written after the fact based upon the spec. The manuals were not written by the developers, and the guys writing the manuals did not have a full appreciation for all the places that they cut corners and all the places where doctrine was sort of built in. The specific example I'm thinking of is that they discovered that changing the shot doctrine on an Aegis cruiser did not actually change. You could twiddle the knob all day long. It didn't actually change what the program did. They hardwired in the current U.S. Navy doctrine, and you could not change it despite the fact it said you could.
Yeah, but in these cases, though, those were professionally designed things to meet a specific professional purpose, right?
Yeah, and it's always important to know what that purpose is.
Well,
I've had this conversation with James Sterrett. When I talk with James Sterrett about that, he laughs because he's got the exact opposite complaint. He's got the problem with people. He uses war games as an educational tool.
Yeah.
And they've got people coming up to them with analytical tools saying, I want to use this for education. And it's like the problem he runs into is he likes it when the doctrine is built in because he's there to teach the doctrine. He doesn't like it
in some cases, yes, that is absolutely the case.
Yeah.
But and again, I'm going back to a ground combat example because that's the stuff I know. The 7 Days to the Rhine series of war games that S&T Press published in Modern War, and I think they ended up wrapping them up in Strategy and Tactics magazine after Modern War imploded. There was a thread on Board Game Geek where folks were talking about the way in which the game plays in some cases. And one of my big pet peeves is the fact that very, very few land combat games get the role of cavalry in a modern context correct. And the Fifth Corps series does. Very few others do. And one of the things that was being discussed was this one player was talking about his tactics that essentially the screen line on the inner German border where you found the 11th ACR and 2nd ACR in the 80s, because that was their role. They were the cavalry regimental guard and cover mission, depending on what phase the operation it was, out in front of their appropriate corps, 2nd Corps and 5th Corps. And this guy was saying that, no, man, I don't put my cavalry units up on the border. They're way too valuable for that. I let the German territorials do that job because they're going to get overrun anyway. So you've just completely broken doctrine by throwing a bunch of reservists up on the border where they never would have been in order to conserve an overpowered cav regiment somewhere else on the map that only exists as an overpowered unit because you've aggregated it into a footprint that it would never actually have on the battlefield. Yeah. And so, when you look at it, it's a battalion-sized unit. Let's count up the how many tubes it's got of different kinds of whether it's artillery or tank tubes or whatever. You add it all up and it's got, that's way more firepower than your average battalion has, so we're going to give it a higher combat factor. Everybody goes, oh, well, that's my heavy hitter, ignoring the fact that all of that combat power would be spread over 5 hexes instead of 1, and that unit would take up a lot more footprint, which disperses all that firepower. That's why it is as overpowered as it is it's expected to cover a lot more frontage. That is an example of completely ignoring the doctrine because it wasn't baked into the game. And the game gives the player the option to do that. Okay, it's a game for fun, right? That's a hobby game. He's supposed to be able to completely ignore that doctrine and do whatever the hell he wants, regardless of how ahistorical that might have been. So
and the justification he uses to do it is he'd rather the other guys die instead.
Yeah, and okay, fine. And from a purely numeric standpoint, it is a rational decision.
Oh, it's sacrifice
the underpowered units to slow down somebody else so your big hitters survive longer to do more damage later in the battle. I get it. It's a rational decision under those circumstances, brought about by some design issues that either ignore the doctrine or make it impossible to follow the doctrine. My point being, to tie it all back around to the beginning, is part of the point of these games is you kind of ought to be able to ignore some of that doctrine. If you're going to try to win Waterloo, Bulge, Stalingrad, Gettysburg, whatever, like pick one of the 12 big games, the big battles that we're always refighting over and over. Some of those losses may well have been caused by the loser adhering too closely to their doctrine, which straitjacketed them to a more creative solution that could have potentially won the battle. War games don't straitjacket them. that much necessarily, such that they can explore alternative ways that they could win that battle. There's probably a comparable argument to be made for any sort of naval warfare that I just don't know the doctrine well enough. And so Rocky will yell at me about all the things I just said wrong. I don't see in the hobby war game space the lack of doctrinal straitjackets to be a bad thing.
The reason why doctrinal straitjackets exist is because, a determination's been made that you'll do better if you follow doctrine than if you don't, right? So those doctrinal straitjackets frequently are there to compensate for other things that frequently are not included in a war game. So, maybe, if the doctrine says you do X, there's a reason why you do that. And that's not always captured in the game design because they assume that you're going to follow doctrine.
Yeah, when maybe you don't have to.
A variation of this, I mean, the very obvious variation of this is games are different if you include supply. Games play differently if you include supply. If you don't include supply, people do crazy ass shit, right? Hey, why does it take so long to get to Moscow? I can just go zooming ahead, right?
Yeah.
20 miles a day, that's insane. I could do at least 100, okay?
Till you outrun your fuel truck. Yeah.
Well, you outrun your fuel truck, but if your game doesn't have fuel trucks.
Yeah, you don't have to make the argument for me that, we don't do logistics well in war games. I've written on that quite a bit and published plenty of them at the Dragoons and elsewhere. So, Rocky, what's your take on this whole doctrinal argument here?
Well, I'm trying to wrap it back down to naval wargaming. And I think, at the risk of going back to where we started, it's what do the players want? The players, you can have the greatest Navy war game out there, and if the players just take it and do the wrong, do the ahistorical, do the non-doctrinal pieces, you'll still have a game, and you'll still have ships going on blowing up, and then maybe you'll have, like what Chris was there, that he got into that one game and the guy ruined the experience for everyone because they went off and they did something that was not appropriate for the period or for the game and such. So, I mean, what do naval war games get right? I mean, they give you a lot of the tools, and maybe in some ways, naval war games are easier to break than some of your land games are, just because maybe people are not as familiar with what the doctrine was. Or, I mean, Steve Newberg's game, the whole idea, we're here to talk about immunity zones, and people are going like, immunity zones, I needed that for COVID. It's a totally different concept, and what are we talking about? But in that particular game, it's very important. And if you understand the immunity zone, you are probably going to win that game pretty much every time, especially if you're up against somebody who has no idea what that even is. Take advantage of the game, take advantage of the model. It got it right, but at the same time, maybe the players are not going to use it right, which makes a lot of people maybe sometimes say the game is wrong. Yeah,
and I can think of a specific example of that was a conversation I saw on Consumel back in the day. They were talking about GDW's Third World War series, and somebody was talking about how the Russian Air Force stuff, the Soviet bloc Air Force stuff was just totally broken. And it's like, well, what do you mean it's broken? Tell me what you're trying to do. And the guy sort of basically laid out what he was trying to do and why and this doesn't work at all. And he goes, well, yeah, you're thinking like an American. That force is not designed to be used that way. And so the person made the argument. It's like, if you play the American Air Force like Americans, if you play the Allies like Allies, and you play the Russians like if you use their doctrine, their force is designed for their doctrine, and their doctrine is designed for their force. And so, you're going to maximize
which is as it should be. I mean,
which is as it should be. I mean, you maximize your potential if you do stuff like that. I mean, you look at the difference between a Russian airplane and an American airplane. The Russian airplanes had to do depot level maintenance on their engines after a stunningly short period of time. Well, why is that? Because the Russians make the assumption that in wartime, the plane isn't going to last very long anyway. Whereas our assumption was always, yeah, that's true, but most of the time we're not at war. Most of the time we're at peace. So we need a long mean time between failures, and we need as much stuff to be able to be fixed forward, not at the depot, so that we can be ready when the war actually starts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that applies to the Russian naval forces too. If you go up to Fall River, Massachusetts, you can see a Tarantal class missile boat. It was the Hidden Sea. It was an East German Navy vessel. And so the Berlin Wall goes down. The U.S. Navy acquires this thing. It's got diesel engines for everyday cruising and gas turbines for sprints. And so we did the foreign material exploitation on it. We put it through its paces and figured out what it could and couldn't do, et cetera, et cetera. Plan A was to turn it over to somebody to use as a Red Force asset in exercises. They never did that because the gas turbines in that ship were rated for 26 hours, if I remember correctly. And they had 20 hours on them already.
Yeah.
And
so they were
said,
already getting close to done.
Yeah, they're already getting close to having to do depot level maintenance on them. And they said, all right, we'll just turn it into a museum ship. And so you can go take a tour of it. It's actually kind of neat.
Yeah. We're going to wrap this up here with Chris. Give us a final thought on sort of what naval wargaming tends to get right and what they tend to get wrong. Big picture, one over the world overview.
Boy, what an assignment that is.
That was
500 words max.
minutes
Please
ago.
show your work.
So I'm going to do something maybe a little bit different than that. I would say my recommendation to players is find a time period that you like and see what you like in that time period. Nothing that any of us have said today should make you not like something that you currently like. If you're having a good time gaming, go do what you're doing. If you're not having a good time gaming, then maybe we've given you some helpful hints on why you're not having a good time with it. Whatever time period or whatever you're doing. But I've always had good results with, find a time period that I'm interested in and then see what the games are available in that time period.
Yeah. Rocky, close us out here, man.
Naval war games get it right, players get it wrong. I think that that's where we started. But I'll echo exactly what Chris said. I mean, maybe there is a sweet spot of gaming that's not modern. Maybe there's a sweet spot of gaming that is. I mean, I know a lot of people love World War I games, naval war games, partially because there's a lot of big guns. A lot of your ranges, a lot of the complexity of the search, you can game it right out by saying we're just going to start at visual search range and close in. There's not aircraft. Submarines are still primitive. Many times you can just ignore it, and you just focus on the game of those naval battles with the big guns booming across the seas. And it's fun, and it feels right enough that you can enjoy it. So I would echo what Chris said. Find a game period that you like, explore it, figure out what's out there, and worry more about playing the game and just enjoying the game than figuring out, does the game get it right? Does the game get it wrong? This isn't a history quiz. It's a game. Go out and enjoy your games and just have fun. Maybe you'll learn something along the way. Maybe you'll figure out that, I should apply the right doctrine or the period appropriate doctrine, and maybe that does help. Or maybe you say, hey, this is the time to break that doctrine. Don't stay in the van, don't stay in the line, break through like some guy named Nelson did once in a while. But figure out what's fun. And that's really what it comes down to. They're war games. So enjoy the games, even if they are at sea.
Fair enough. All right, audience. Thank you very much for floating around with us on this one. We appreciate you joining us on this episode. And we're getting close to wrapping this thing up. We're also getting close to summer convention season. By the time you're listening to this, Connections Online will be imminent, and Buckeye Game Fest right after that, which means Circle DC will be in the rearview mirror by the time you are hearing this. But there's also all sorts of other conventions coming up, so keep an eye on our convention event calendar. We also have an excerpt from that in each week's Tuesday Newsday, each edition of that. Origins is our next big event after Buckeye Game Fest. We're going to be there with 60-odd wargaming events that we're going to have going on while we're there. And then also, as we announced last week, on our show talking about BGF. Coming up in October, the week of the 20th, the weekend of the 20th of October, we are going to be hosting our first in-person little mini convention at Gamers Armory down here in Cary, North Carolina. The one of the best war game stores in the country has graciously given us about half of their floor space to set up our own little mini convention in. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to start pushing some of the details out once we get past Connections Online. But in the meantime, start making some travel plans, making excuses to get out of your cousin's wedding, and start eyeballing some hotels down in the Crossroads area of Cary so that you can come join us at Gamers Armory. They've agreed to extend their hours a little bit to allow us a little more time and access to their game tables to be able to play. And we'd love to see y'all come join us there. So that's what's coming up. In the meantime, thank you, Rocky. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you guys being here. And we'll catch the audience next time on another episode of Mentioning Dispatches.
Good night.